All right, welcome everybody. John Perry here. I am accompanied by Dr. Caitlin Kight. Welcome.
Hello, thank
She
you.
she is. How did we meet? We met online.
We did.
Probably.
I think we had some mutual interests and shared contacts, and we were on social media feed together.
Yeah. You had bought a T-shirt, and you
I
sent
had.
me that. Yeah,
Yeah.
a stated clearly T-shirt, and you sent a photo of you doing. It was the Darwin Day hike.
Yep.
Yeah. That was in England somewhere, right? That was in.
Yeah. Yeah, there have been a couple now, so I forget which one that one was, but it got, I think it was in the New Forest, and that shirt did get quite a lot of attention during the hike that day.
Yeah, cool. And then we met in real life. We met 2 years ago at TetZooCon.
That's right,
Yeah.
in London.
Yep. So TetZooCon, for those who don't know, is a conference about tetrapod zoology that's put on by Dr. Darren Naish, and he's an anthropologist, zoologist, I guess you describe him. He's got a podcast, the Tet Zoo podcast, which is absolutely wonderful, and he's got his Tet Zoo blog that he's been writing on for like years and years and years. And I went down there. It's a really cool mix of science, art, and researchers working together to do work on projects together and just kind of appreciate the science of zoology. So that's where Dr. Kight and I first met in real life, but it was after years of us talking back and forth. So
Yeah.
it was really cool to finally meet up. And now you've just written a book and I've got you on my show, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because I just want to do some quick announcements real quick. So obviously I am back to doing Sunday morning science broadcasts. I moved, which is why I had 2 weeks off, but I'm now in Canada and I'm in a different time zone, but I'm still going to keep doing this at the 10 a.m. Pacific time because, now that's 1 in the afternoon for me, which is kind of nice. I can sleep in on Sundays. But I'm now in Montreal. I have an interview tonight with Shannon Q. She's going to be talking with me about the debate that I did a couple of weeks ago about the genetic code. Is the genetic code a real code? And so we'll kind of go over how all that went down. So watch that tonight. It's at 9 p.m. East Coast time, so that's midnight Pacific time. And we're going to do it live, but it'll also be available to watch afterwards. And then on the 6th, I am doing a debate with Perry Marshall. Perry Marshall he's been on the show before. He is, I don't want to describe him wrong because he doesn't like being called a creationist, but he leans towards creationism. And we're going to be talking specifically about teleology and purpose. So do organisms, is there a purpose in the way that animals are built? Is there teleology in biology? So that's what we're going to be talking about. He's got kind of a non-standard view on that. And I say debate, but basically Perry Marshall, for those of you who saw the last time he was on, he's a really smart guy. He's really fun to hang out with and chat with about things. And he has some really interesting insights, even though he disagrees with most biologists and he disagrees with me on a lot of things. So it'll be fun. But we're recording that on the 6th, and I'm not sure if he's going to want to do that live or not because we've had, in the past, we've pre-recorded things and then edited things down, which we might do this time as well. It's kind of tricky to do a debate without a moderator. It's just going to be him and I without, things getting heated or you go off on really weird tangents. So we'll edit some stuff out. But anyway, so that's my schedule for this upcoming week. Next Sunday, unless I get someone to come on and to do a live show with, I will be doing a video about essentially the selfish gene, different papers that look at biology, look at genetics, the genome as a collection of genes that are either cooperating with each other or competing against each other, even in the same genome. There's some really interesting research that's been going on with this, where you look at genes as organisms and you look at the genome as an ecological system. It's really, really cool stuff. You probably know that, you know, this term, the selfish gene, comes from Richard Dawkins' work that was, I think, back in the 70s. Not really his research, but a book that he wrote summarizing research that other people had done. And a lot has changed since then. Some of the things he kind of over-exaggerated in his original book. Not over-exaggerated. At the time, it was all accurate, but some things have changed a little bit. And we'll kind of go over where things are today. So that'll be pretty fun. But, all right. So back to Dr. Kight here. You have written a book, which was very lovely. I got to read it this week. I ordered it, and the hard copy didn't come, but you sent me a PDF because you're so awesome, so that I could get caught up before today's
Don't tell
interview.
my publishers.
Okay. Hopefully they're not watching.
Yeah.
But anyway, tell us about your book.
Right. So my book is called Flamingo, and it's a part of something called the Animal series. And I'm allowed to say this without bias because I reviewed the series before I contributed to it. And they're really pretty books, and they're really interesting. They've got amazing images and lots of really interesting content, a huge breadth of different authors. So people who have some very different perspectives on the animals that they're writing about. So I had read a bunch of the bird ones prior to writing mine. Mm-hmm. And I think, if I recall correctly, I was the first person who was actually a biologist to write about the birds in the bird part of the series. And I think that's quite interesting. They had anthropologists and other types of people thinking about birds, and everyone has their own different perspectives. So I tried to ground it a bit more in the science, I guess.
Right. Now, so this series had been going on for a while. Not people necessarily with a scientific background that were writing these, but your book is very. It's Flamingos is the book, and you go into basically you summarize our current knowledge on flamingos. I mean, yeah. You go in depth. And what do we call a book like this that's just summarizing the scientific literature on a specific topic? Is there like a specific name, or is this a genre? Or
yeah, I have a really hard time when people ask me to describe it, because in a way it is pop science, popular science, but about half of the book is not really science, it's culture. So you could call it natural history or cultural history. So I always do kind of say it's a natural and cultural history of the flamingo. And so I can't really think of a more succinct way really to describe that type of work.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. It's a review of the literature, and it happens to be in that kind of realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A review of the literature basically for the public. Now within the scientific literature, actually, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll talk about that in a minute, but the book is great. It talks about all the different species of flamingos. It talks about the history of flamingos and humans, like what people have thought of them. It talks, there's so many different things that it discusses. And there's some really crazy facts in there. And I'm just wondering from you, what is the craziest fact about flamingos that everyone should know, but they don't?
Right. So there's really only one answer to this question, I think, and it's the answer I always give, and it feels a bit boring at this point, but that is the fact that flamingos have in their mouths and in their throats what we would basically classify as erectile tissue. So it's exactly the same sort of tissue that you would find giving erections in male mammals, and this is what flamingos have in their mouths and throats, so that when they are inverted and feeding with the tops of their heads facing down and they're sucking water back through as they're trying to filter feed, that gives them the necessary pressure to keep that process happening so that they can pump the water through and get the little animals out of the water and into their mouths. So I think it's fascinating, and you can see some really great images of the vasculature in their mouths so that you can see where there are all these nerves and blood vessels that allow this to happen.
Yeah, that would be the one that stuck out to me the most as well. Independently. We didn't plan this in advance. Yeah, flamingos have erectile tissue in their mouths. Something that is kind of interesting that most people don't know is that we actually have a little bit of erectile tissue in our noses. Mammals do, which helps regulate. It'll inflame and then go down according to temperature to help regulate moisture intake and so on. But yeah, it's interesting to see such a developed structure in the mouth of a bird. Which does that exist in other birds?
Not that I'm aware of. It is really unique to the way that they feed, and they are one of very few organisms that has this kind of upside down pattern of feeding.
Yeah. And if none of you have seen this, well, first of all, buy our book. You'll see all kinds of photos of it. But if you want to watch it, there's tons of videos. If you just type in flamingo feeding, you can watch flamingos feeding, and they put their head upside down, and they're just in the water, and it looks like they're kind of like munching on the water, and they're just, their mouth is, when they open and close, it just acts like this pump. Water just goes through and kind of does it squirt out the back?
Yeah, I mean, they kind of are like whales in a sense with the baleen, but in flamingos it's called lamellae. So yeah, they're kind of just squishing it through the lamellae and then back out the sides.
Yeah. And yeah, they're filtering the water like you said, just like a whale. Super fascinating creatures, really weird animals.
They are.
And aside from all the things we could talk about flamingos, maybe we could do another day where we just talk about flamingos the whole time. But the thing that's been most on my mind lately is, how do we process the scientific literature? How do we understand the scientific, like, how do we navigate it? Because, most people in my audience are outside of the scientific field, but even people in the scientific field, like, the work that you did on this book required you to become an expert on flamingo literature. And I've talked about this before on my channel, but in science, an expert is someone that knows what has been studied, what has not been studied, what the debates are in a particular field. They understand that field, the research that's been done, and the research that's being done. And you are, I mean, I would say after writing a book like this, you must be like the top 10 people on flamingo expertise. This literature, and so many of us get in marketing now. So right now I'm in my 30s and starting to gain the belly weight that's kind of typical of a man in his 30s. And I don't want to, because I know that it's bad for me to let that go. So I've been trying to learn a little bit about weight loss, like healthy weight loss, or just a better way to live my life more healthy as far as diet goes and exercise. And trying to navigate the literature on this is absolutely insane. People are marketing all kinds of stuff to me for weight loss, and that there seems to be contradictions in the literature. When you're going to a new field, maybe something you're not super familiar with, and I know your primary research when you're getting your PhD was not on flamingos specifically. It was on, you did a lot of work with birds, but so I would imagine that this was kind of a new field for you, right? Just flamingos in general.
Yeah, very much.
How do you just start into the literature from cold, basically,
Yeah,
and make sense of what's going on?
it's actually something I'm doing again right now, because I'm an academic developer, so I educate people, and you have to know the education pedagogy, and that's not my background. And so anytime you approach a new topic, I always feel quite nervous, because you're so aware of your own boundaries and your own limitations, and you're aware that other people know where to start and that you don't, and you don't know who's considered good and what research is considered good. So for me, one of the best things is being able to use Google to do a quick scan of what people have written about informally, and then to find out who are the names that keep popping up, what are the certain buzzwords or key ideas that keep coming up, because that will then help you to do a better search when you're looking for the literature, and it will help you kind of hone who is most respected, I guess. And when you do that, you can pick a few of those people's papers or papers on that sort of topic, and see what is cited and who is cited within those, and that will start opening doors And so you start having this growing mound of literature on your desk. And I think one of the really useful things that we talked about the term earlier, review. So anytime you can find a review article where someone who is an expert in the field is summarizing all that's known from all the other experts in the field, that's really helpful. And those don't always exist. Reviews are written often by PhD students as a first chapter, so they might publish those, but you don't always have a review in your particular field. So that's always kind of a nice thing to stumble on when it's relevant.
Well, that brings up a good point. Let's talk about the different types of papers that you find. I mean, there's in biology, I guess there's like field work papers where people are just describing what they've seen in the field. You've got in the lab experiments, and then you've got these review papers. If you could kind of explain the difference between, well, anything that I'm missing as well, what types of papers you'll find.
So a review paper is something that's basically saying, this is the state of the field today. So I wrote one of these, and it came out of my first chapter of my dissertation, where all of us have to review everyone else that's gone before, and you kind of summarize that. And a really good review is not just one where you're saying, here is the sum total of what we know. It's one where you're then taking that to propose some new ideas. So reviews might just be old stuff, but it might also be some new stuff to push things forward. Mm-hmm. And then you might have something where it's what we would typically call, in my field at least, your experimental chapter, where you are talking about, here is the question that I had, here is what I was trying to answer, here are the things that I did to get there, and then these were the results, and here's what I think we now know about the field, and here are the new questions that we have to follow up on. Mm-hmm. And then you will also have things where someone perhaps is just saying, this is a new technique that we might want to try. And so someone might just be purely describing a methodology and now saying, right, now someone go out and do that and tell me what it's like. Or you might have something where someone is being theoretical in another fashion, where they are, for example, running a model, or they are drawing up diagrams and just saying, logically, this makes sense. Here's a new way of thinking. What do you guys think? So there are lots of different ways to just kind of propose new ideas without doing the experiment or basing it off of someone else in a review style. And then, as you said, there might be things where people are purely just kind of describing their own experiences. We often have these anecdotal types of papers where you're saying, this is not a full-scale study, but this was a really interesting thing I saw. Take this information and make of it what you will.
Yeah.
And so those, I think, are the main types in my particular field. I'm sure that other areas of science or even research have other types as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you are brand new to a subject, you recommend heading for these review articles.
Yeah, definitely. If those exist, then the whole point of a review is that someone is pulling together 30, 40, 50 different papers that have been written, and they're usually the key papers with the key arguments. And so if you've got the review, then right there you've got a list of all the main things that you probably should read. And even if you can't read them all, you'll at least have a good summary of what they say. So you have a really quick way to wrap your mind around what are the main questions we still have, and how do we get to where we are today.
Yeah. And these review papers, they have within them, they have links to all the different research articles that they're basing their review paper on. So you can actually go back and look at the actual experiments as well. But so I guess just to kind of summarize where we're at right now in this conversation, in the scientific literature, a lot of what you find are reports on experiments, reports on observations. And if you just start digging into that, you can get lost. I mean, you've got thousands and thousands of papers to read just to understand, what we know about flamingos, for example. But if you go to the reviews, people who are experts in the field are going to have summarized the bulk of the research so far. Now, obviously, there's going to be conflicts, right, in research. So one of the things that I see all the time is that people will argue, for right now, like I said, I've been looking at how to eat a healthier diet, and I'll find people saying that sugar is the enemy, added sugar is the enemy. Some people say that fruit, even just eating fruit, is bad for obesity. And then other people are saying that fruit is super healthy, but you shouldn't have added sugar. Like there's all these conflicting research, these experiments. And this is super common, by the way, in anything studying human psychology or human diet and so on, because we can't really do very good experiments on humans because we're not allowed to. We can't just, there's lots of ethical issues involved with experimenting on humans. And so it's very difficult. We have to do these really broad statistical analyses of people's diet choices and so on to try and figure out what types of diets are the healthiest. So there's actually a lot of conflict. There's very little, I guess, resolution to problems that occur in human nutrition research. But I've just noticed that there are some pretty dramatic contradicting opinions that different scientists have based on their research. Maybe there wasn't that in flamingos, but how do you deal with, especially if you have two reviewers review papers that are contradicting each other? How do you deal with that conflict?
So I did actually have, there was one obvious conflict that came up when I was reviewing Flamingo, and it wasn't, well, I guess it kind of was in a bit of a review paper. So there have been a couple of different camps arguing over Flamingo evolution for a couple of decades now, actually. And I think we've gotten to the point where it's pretty conclusively been decided what Flamingo evolution looks like. But at the time that these papers had come out that I got my hands on, so in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, these people kept arguing back and forth saying, look, we're looking at these characteristics, and it clearly shows flamingos are most closely related to these birds. And then there would be another argument or response to that paper saying, no, it's definitely these things, we're looking at these. And I'm not an expert enough to actually be able to distinguish. And these people are experts claiming something very different. And so the best that I could do is read the things that they're citing, read around the issues. So they were saying, we're using genetics, we're using brood parasites or shape of the egg, all sorts of different characteristics that they're saying that this is how you can tell. So I could read around those characteristics and get a sense of what they were using to base their arguments on. And then you just kind of come up with your own opinion, or you do the unsatisfactory kind of political journalistic thing of saying, well, there is this argument out there and no one really knows, but here is what they think. And I think actually it is a really good thing where if you aren't entirely sure, then you probably should admit it. Even if you are trying to become the expert and it's your own paper that you're writing and you're saying, actually, we don't know this yet, or I haven't proven this yet, but the evidence says this. But you always do have the option, of course, of reaching out to people and asking them directly. So you could just approach, if not the people who were in the argument, then some other third party and say, well, what's your impression? What do you think?
Yeah. I'd like to get to how accessible scientists are in a second, but this question of conflicts, a lot of people think that if there's a scientific paper about it, then it's true. And that is definitely not the case.
No.
The scientific literature is where people report on their experiments, they report on their data, and then they put forth their conclusions. They put forth their ideas about what's actually happening here. And the scientific literature is where scientists go to argue with each other. I mean, a paper that's peer-reviewed and published in a journal, it's been peer-reviewed, so people have read over it to make sure that it's not just total garbage. But that doesn't mean that the conclusions are false. It doesn't mean that the data is good even. It means that it looks like the data is good, and it looks like the conclusions they're coming to follow the data. But that's all. I mean, you'll see people arguing back and forth in the literature all the time. And I see this with people that are, especially that are trying to sell you diet or products or herbal products. They are, vitamins and stuff. They'll cite a paper and they'll say, oh, look, there's proof that this thing that I'm selling you works. And they're just citing one or two papers in a vast literature that's going back and forth to people arguing. So how much should we trust the scientific literature? I mean, is the scientific literature true? What's your
Yeah.
thought on that?
Well, so the thing that I would say is in researching flamingo, I looked back to literature that went all the way back into the 18th, 17th centuries even. So these are
Mhm.
people who were writing in their time, having just discovered flamingos in the Caribbean and South America and so on. And they would write these accounts. And that at the time that that was published, that was the sum total of what was known about certain species or certain behaviors. And so you've got people saying, yes, flamingos sit on their nests and their legs are in front of them and bent just like we would sit on a stool. So they're sitting on their nests like we sit on stools.
Hmm.
And then you've got someone saying, no, that's hogwash. Um, 40 years later, we've reached the 18th century where we know things now, we've adventured around. Flamingos definitely incubate with their legs stuck out straight behind them. Fast forward, I don't know what it must have been, another 100 years, and someone finally said, what are you people talking about? Actually, flamingos incubate nests like every other bird. They just tuck their legs underneath them. And that is true. But, in each of those time frames, the people were reporting what they thought was true.
What
And
a
so
strange controversy.
I know, it's a really nitpicky kind of thing. But it does show that all papers are just what we think is true at a time, given the knowledge that we
Mhm.
have. And
Yeah.
sometimes that knowledge is because someone, so that very first guy, he probably was looking at flamingos from a distance. He didn't have binoculars. That's what it looked like. So he thought that was accurate and he wrote that down. The
Yeah.
next guy, maybe he interviewed some people who lived in the neighborhood and that was what they told him. And so he reported that. And so it really depends on where your data have come from, how those have been analyzed, how those have been reported. And
Mhm.
all we can ever do is just know that everything should be taken with a grain of salt,
Yeah.
because that's the whole thing with science, is that the very next measurement you take could completely contradict every measurement you've taken before, no matter how many there are.
Yeah.
So all of it is about saying what percentage of all the publications are reporting this particular thing, how rigorous were all of those publications that are reporting this, all the people who do this the most and know this the best, what are they thinking at the moment? So it really is weighing all of that up and keeping in mind that we're all human
Yeah.
and we all do make mistakes, but that little by little we can add and push things forward. And so you're
Yeah.
always improving, you're always honing.
Yeah. I took a course a long time. I was volunteering at a zoo. I was in Knoxville, Tennessee. And this was years and years ago. And they had this training course for everybody who's new at the zoo, volunteering and going to be teaching people about animals and wildlife. And they had one of the questions on their little test was, which sources are accurate, and it's had like a news source, a blog, and then a scientific journal. And they were arguing that anything in the scientific literature is true because it's peer reviewed, and that's an extremely common opinion. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, there's just nothing that's capital T true. There's just not. Even the scientific literature, it's where people go to argue about the things that they're observing. And as you've just mentioned here with the leg position, even observations that you would think should be super clear cut aren't necessarily clear cut. And this is this is especially true when we're dealing with things in genetics, things in as I was mentioning earlier, things about diet science. The observations that we make, trying to understand cause and effect, can be extremely difficult, and so there's good reason for people to be debating things. So yeah, I mean, knowing that it'd be nice if we could actually learn what's completely true, but everything really is a process. So you had mentioned that one of the things you can do when you see a conflict in the literature is you can actually contact the researchers. And this is something that I've been doing from the start, was stated clearly doing my animations. And it's been extremely helpful. And I'm curious, most people who are going to be looking at the scientific literature, people in my audience, they're not necessarily writing a book or creating a video or, doing something that's major for the public. Maybe they're just curious about something. When is it appropriate to contact a scientist, and when are you just bothering someone that's a professor and has a bunch of stuff to do? I mean, how do you judge that?
Well, so I think that different people have very different attitudes about where the boundaries are and what a scientist's or any researcher's responsibility is to the public. Um, I have always been a big fan myself of reaching out to people, and I did this even when I was quite young. And I remember when I was in high school, I wrote to E.O. Wilson, eminent scholar. And,
Yeah.
in my ignorance, I just thought, well, why not? Because his book, Naturalist, is really what made me decide that I could be the biologist that I wanted to be. So I wrote him a letter, not really expecting a reply, just to say, this meant a lot to me, thanks. And of course, I never did hear back, but I did meet him later, and he was a lovely guy. And I told him I had written him, and he just said, oh, I just don't ever have time to respond to these things. And I can totally understand that.
Yeah,
on the other end of the spectrum are people like me, not a preeminent person. And I get messages about my book. I get messages about my academic papers. I get messages from students who think they kind of want to go into my area or come to my university, or are just interested in the kind of stuff I'm interested in. And I always do feel like I should try to find a way to make the time to respond, even if it's a quick response.
Yeah.
And that's partly because I like outreach. I do outreach. I think a lot of younger scientists in particular are really keen on public engagement, because there is this recognition that climate change isn't great. And if we connect people to the planet, we can reverse that. So I think a lot of people are really into this. But I definitely think, because my postdoctoral grant and some of my undergrad and PhD grant money came from public sources, my science, my expertise was paid for by the public. I want to give back. I'm at a public institution now. I want to give back. And so I try to answer every question that I can, because I do think, we have been in a way paid for by the public, and so they should have some sort of access.
Yeah. Oh, about E.O. Wilson, he's, I would say, a celebrity scientist, right?
Yeah.
So, he's been in tons of videos, like TV. He's been all over the place. So reaching someone like him is genuinely difficult. But most researchers I have found, now of course I'm making a video, so I tell them that in the first sentence, which I think makes people more eager to, they don't want their science, they don't want their science portrayed incorrectly in this video. But I have found people to be extremely accessible. A couple years ago, there was a trend in high schools where they would assign students to write a scientist and ask them questions about their research, and people got super annoyed by that, because they were getting, if you happen to be popular, or if your research happened to be popular among high school students, you're getting tons of letters from kids that are obviously just trying to get a grade on their class, and they don't actually care. Some of them did, obviously, but I have found that most researchers will respond to me, and sometimes even when I'm not talking about a video. Sometimes I just have a question. If my letter is super short and it's clear to them that I read the paper of interest, most papers have a contact author. They'll tell you which person you're supposed to email if you have questions. And if that person's still alive, if it's a relatively new paper, you can usually get a response. And then the other trick that I've learned, and I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be teaching people this, but professors, if someone's a professor, they usually have office time where they're supposed to answer questions or meet with students in their office, and they'll answer their phone during that time if they don't have a student that they're literally talking to at the moment. So I found that if I'm not able to get a hold of someone, I can call them in office hours and they'll pick up their phone.
There are a lot of lists I've seen circulating online now as well, where people who are willing to answer questions and talk to schools and all sorts of things will sign up. And there are a lot of subject-specific ones, or ones with women scientists, or ones with women or people of color, LGBTQ. So there are all sorts of flavors of these, and I think that's really helpful as well. Where if you think I generally want to ask about what it's like to be a woman in science, or I like biology, but how can I find the right biologist to ask? These lists are out there for the public, so that you could probably track down someone who's a bit more amenable than rather than just taking a stab in the dark.
Yeah, and finding people on Twitter is also a new thing that you can do, because there's a lot of researchers on there that are just obviously, if they're on Twitter and they're tweeting about their research, they'll also respond if you send them a message, usually.
Yeah.
So yeah, people are a lot more accessible than you think. Again, if someone's a celebrity, it's just like in any other field. If someone's a celebrity, it's hard to get a hold of them because lots of people are always trying to get a hold of them. But most researchers, I don't know, I feel like research is kind of a lonely profession because you become an expert in one thing, and if someone writes you and they have a genuine question about this very specific thing that you've been researching, and it's obvious that they've read the papers that you've done and they know what you've written in there, and they just want some extra data, like it seems like that, like, if someone writes me about the things I'm super interested in, I usually respond.
It's a bit of an ego stroke, I have to say, when someone says, I've read your paper and I want to use your methods. But it is true. You're absolutely right. I think there's nothing more exciting than when someone is interested in what you're interested in, so you can geek out together.
Yeah, right. Let's see, we were talking about, let me pull up my questions here again. So you, in your book, you didn't just do scientific literature. I mean, well, first of all, what's the big difference between older scientific literature and modern scientific literature? Because you had to dive through everything.
Yeah, I did. It is really funny when you do that as well. So I had previously taken a history of science course, which I always thought was really interesting. I think people in my class didn't so much. So I was a little bit prepared for this because I had read some pretty old stuff before. But it is funny when you've got the people who are basically, they're just explorers. So they just go off on an adventure and say, here are the hundreds of things I saw. And then they say a lot of slanderous things about the natives. They're thinking, oh my gosh, this was considered science back in the day. So it's kind of just like an adventure log. And then you fast forward a little bit, and you've got kind of like your armchair scientists, Victorian types, like your kind of layperson's Darwin almost. And those are a bit more experimental, but often the the scientific process is not entirely there from start to finish, or some of the ethics are a little bit wonky. And it's quite interesting as well when you read stuff from the zoo literature or the wild animal literature versus, someone who's doing kind of the sort of thing I do, which is animal behavior experiments or observation. So each field is very different. And you do notice that there are different languages, as in the jargon is different. The way that they approach asking a question and answering a question is different. What they consider to be a methodology, what they consider to be appropriate and conclusive, what statistics they think are good enough to come up with an answer based on. So, back in the day, way far back in the day, there weren't even stats. And then you got to some stats that we would not consider rigorous, like maybe high school level kind of stats today. So it's really all over the place. And it can be difficult to say, well, this one is as good as this one, because actually it's a whole other field by that point, basically.
Yeah. I was just looking up stuff on rattlesnakes a while back, and it's funny, you go back a little bit in the literature, and they're setting up fights between rattlesnakes and different animals, and they're cutting off the rattle to see if it affects things. They're taking a snake and cutting off its tail and then making it fight a mammal and see what happens. It's just like, you gotta be kidding me. And then, like you said, the stuff they'll say about natives, or the stuff that they'll say, it's pretty interesting going back in time. So aside from the scientific literature, you looked at historical documents or how different cultures perceive the flamingo. And how did you go
Yeah.
about that? Like, where did you get it?
Yeah, I found that really challenging. So in some of the other books in this series, things like Owl, for example, owls are around the world. It's quite
Mhm,
easy. They're very prominent. Crows, things like that. It is not hard to find these things in other cultures without
mhm,
even looking. You Google something and you can find it. With flamingos, flamingos occur only in very specific places. And some of those places are not places where there is much of a long-term history that you can access. So, for example, they're up in the way far distant mountains in Chile or in Argentina.
mhm.
And so, of course, there are local cultures that have been there for a long time, but do they have things written down? Have their oral histories been passed on to people who speak English?
Mhm.
Do they even care about flamingos? So if you find an absence of flamingo references, is that because they don't care about flamingos or because we just simply don't have that evidence that I could access and look at sitting here in England?
Yeah.
So it can be really difficult. And what I did was I expanded beyond just the academic literature. So I was looking for newspaper articles, magazine articles, any kind of lay reference. I was looking at literature because you can then start to see, what's in the plays, what's in music, what's in poems, what's in books. So, for example, in Africa, there are two different species of flamingo, and I was able to find some plays that reference flamingos, and then think about what do those references in the plays mean about how people might see flamingos.
Mhm.
Um, you can search museums and see what kinds of things museums have. And in the course of doing that, obviously, if you're looking at visual representations, things don't always look the same as a
Yeah.
biologist would see them. It's often changed, it's often very vague, representative. And so I was writing people who were experts in museums saying, do you think that this is a flamingo? Because I don't think it's a flamingo, even though it's labeled as such.
Yeah.
So I was getting feedback. I was writing. So in the U.S., the southern U.S. and in the Caribbean, there are Native American tribes who may or may not have some history with flamingos. And I was writing people to ask. I have friends from India where there are flamingos. And so I was writing them and saying, look, my understanding is that these don't really feature in your culture. What do you think? So it really was this scattergun approach of looking for anything I could find and any person who was willing to talk to me.
Yeah.
And it was quite an adventure.
Yeah. That's really cool. How many actual researchers do you think you ended up uh, contacting that would actually help you out with this?
Well, so off the top of my head, I forget, but in my acknowledgement section, there is quite a list. So beyond just the people whose papers were quite useful, I interacted with librarians, museum staff. There were people at flamingo and wetland centers who were
Mhm.
quite helpful. So I mean, there were several dozen people, I would say, with whom I had actual conversations over email or in person, and probably the most valuable was someone who was a PhD student at my institution. So that was by chance, actually. I happened to find this out that he was doing his PhD where I am also based at the University of Exeter. And
Mhm.
he has since completed his work. And he was doing his research on flamingos at a wetland center that's about an hour or so from here. And I contacted the Wetland Center, and they were very kind because they're all about research as well as preservation. So they wanted for me to learn and to pass that information on. And so I was getting a lot of information from people who are not considered in the world of flamingos, like flamingo experts. They're
Mhm.
aviculturists, they are people who hand rear flamingos in captivity along with lots of other birds. My friend who was the flamingo researcher, he was a PhD student at the time, and often you don't see students being considered the
Mhm.
experts, but those folks helped me probably more than anyone.
Yeah.
So you never know where you're going to find the right contacts and who's going to be the source of information.
Yeah. Well, you just mentioned that, these people are not necessarily scientists that are rearing flamingos and doing all this. I just went to a reptile expo and was talking to different people that are breeding reptiles, and I wish they would work more. The scientific community would work more with them because they have knowledge and information that's stored in their brains, on their blogs, all over the place. That's
Yeah,
I don't think that researchers have even thought about thinking about. So there's, I mean, an expert in academia might, yeah, it is good to dip into expertise all over the place and
absolutely.
not just think of a university setting as where experts can be found.
Yeah.
Uh, I've got someone asking, curious, what is her opinion on Mayim Bayik? Um, I don't know if you know who this
Oh,
is.
yeah. Is that the lady
Gaelic.
from? Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, the lady from the Big Bang Theory.
Yeah. Okay.
Is that it? That's the sum total of the question of her in general.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the question.
Okay. Um, so I have to say I have quite mixed feelings because I think it's great that she is a scientist and she's very prominent and she's all about, you know, being that in public and a strong woman. She has said a couple of things off the cuff that I've kind of not fully agreed with. But then she has come back and apologized for not thinking them through. So that has impressed me.
Yeah.
So I do always think that a good, strong woman scientist is a great person to have visible, especially someone who will stand up to being asked stupid questions like, "Tell me what gown you're wearing tonight and whose design is that?" When she's someone with a PhD who knows about whatever it is she studied,
Right.
astronomy or physics or whatever. Um,
Right.
but yeah, I do think when you are prominent and in the public, you do have to be quite careful what you say,
Mhm.
especially when you have a big platform because it can affect a lot of people.
Yeah. Uh, I mean, this wasn't totally. We talked about maybe talking about this a little bit, but kind of issues of women in science.
Mm,
It's a little bit off topic of just how to research, how to do scientific research. But my question for you actually comes from me trying to follow someone's work in the past. This was a couple of years ago. I was trying to follow the work of Lynn Margulis.
mm,
She did a lot of research on endosymbiosis and bacteria and so on. And partway through her career, she got divorced and she changed her name. And I didn't know that. And so her work was super interesting to me. And I'm trying to read everything she'd done. And all of a sudden, there was like just her work stopped, And I ended up getting on Wikipedia and realizing that she used to be Sagan, used to be her last name. She was actually married to Carl Sagan. And then I realized this is so weird because I'm trying to follow research on microbial evolution, on endosymbiosis, and now I'm reading about someone's love life instead and the dramas and conflicts of their divorce. Like, this is a weird problem that exists because of the way that we name people in our culture, that family names typically go by the man. And so this is just it just kind of opened my mind to, oh, professional women deal with unique problems that men don't typically have to deal with. So first of all, I'm curious what you think about that specific problem with naming. A lot of people get their PhD with one name, that they get married, they change their name. That's got to be confusing. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be looking up research based on one researcher because that's kind of a good way to get locked into one way of thinking. Maybe I should be just looking at a topic. But what do you think about this? Like, what do you think about name changing as a scientist?
yeah. So I was actually married and I did not change my name. And I think I had always kind of planned to not change my name.
Mm-hmm.
And I had just finished my PhD at the point where I was going to make that decision. And by that point, I had already published both in the scientific literature and the lay literature. And even if I had been kind of tempted, I knew that there would be that kind of broken record, and I didn't like that.
Yeah.
I have friends who have faced a similar thing, and they have kept kind of a nom de plume, if you like, and at work they go by their maiden name, but then on
Mm-hmm.
their passport it's something else.
Right.
And so they did change it in real life, but they just keep publishing under the same name.
Right.
Some folks will do the thing where they say, nay, whatever their maiden name was, and have the whole thing. So I have a colleague who does that. So she
Yeah.
has both her maiden name and her professional name. And so I think, people have found lots of different ways, whatever is most comfortable for them to address it. And I think it's great. I think you should do whatever you want. It's kind of a pain that we do actually have to, think about this and have these thoughts. I think my favorite, of course, is Kelly and Zach Wienersmith having come up with the best joint name ever. So if you're going to double barrel it, you might as well go all in. But I think that the greatest thing now is that you can kind of curate your own research these days. So with something like Google Scholar or your own web page, you can make sure that it doesn't matter quite as much.
Right.
So that if someone like you wanted to follow someone all through their career, you could just find now their Google Scholar page where they have hand added in everything, even from before they were married and now that they're married. So I think that that's maybe the solution, is to let people do whatever they want with their names, but then have a chance to override in a sense through these archives. And I don't know if all of the archives allow that to the same extent, whether, with open access, does that throw a wrench in that makes it more complicated? I'm not sure, but hopefully that is a tool that can allow you to adapt no matter what you decide to do with your name.
Yeah. Someone writes, hold on. Someone's saying Google Scholar often will list good papers accessible too. I think that the conversation here seems to be turning towards a lot of people are talking about names, but also how to find good research just in general as a public layperson.
Right.
But just to finish up this little chat about names, the way that I ended up following Lynn Margulis was through Wikipedia. All of her stuff was listed on there. So luckily, but that's kind of a rare case because she's a fairly famous researcher. Most people don't have a Wikipedia page about them. And if they do, it's not accurate or not complete. Your website has all your literature on it. I noticed that a lot of universities will have their, a page for each professor and all the literature that they've published. So that is super helpful. I guess that's probably just one small issue for women in science that we could talk about. But to get back to this question of how do we find good research on the internet, not all journals are the same, right?
Right.
If something's published in Nature versus, I don't know, another, the Flamingo exclusive or whatever. How do you, tell us about finding literature online.
Right. So Google Scholar actually is really useful. And I have to say, if I'm just, at my desk and I want to find something, I will just do a Google search or go to Google Scholar and do a search and then see what that brings me and then take it from there. So I have to admit that even an academic will go the lazy route, and actually the lazy route's pretty good these days. So if that is all you have, then that's actually not bad. And I think,
you say it's a lazy, but it's the most accurate way, right, to find research.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have access to something like Web of Science or Cambridge Abstracts or whatever systems the universities are using these days, and the fact that I actually don't know what they all are shows you that this is what we do these days. We use Google. So even if you don't have access to those databases, that's fine. I think it is challenging when you are coming across journals that you're not familiar with. So I think even lay people these days kind of know about Science or Nature because they get talked about so much as little examples that you start to learn. But if you're approaching a new field, how do you know? So my field has conservation biology and biological conservation, right? So if you're looking at those two, like, which of these are these equal? Which of them is? And so actually, one is better than the other. Like there typically are better articles in one of those more consistently than the other. And so this is traditionally where people have had They've used things like impact factors. So if you look on a journal's main page, they will list the IF, or the impact factor, or various other metrics that are basically designed to show how much are people citing the papers within that journal. However, there are some issues with this, because there could be, Mendel's work languished in obscurity for years and years before anyone
Right.
published him, but that was super important. So just because something's not being cited doesn't mean it's not important. Just because something is online only and not in press, in physical press, doesn't mean it's not important. There are lots of things that can easily get buried because there's such a high volume of stuff. So there are lots
Right.
of journals now that will take anything just because we want to try to pump it all out. So impact factor means less. There are
Well,
papers like,
tell us
go
what
ahead.
impact factor is, because I don't think most people understand that, and especially how to read it. There's a number associated with
Yeah,
it.
yeah. So I myself don't really know the intricacies of how it's calculated, but basically the higher an impact factor is, the better, because that means that it's something that's having more impact, which means that it is being cited more often, mentioned more often by
And,
other authors in their own papers.
and each paper has an impact factor, or the journal in general has an impact factor?
The journal in general will have an impact factor, but I think there are also metrics on individual papers these days, as well
Okay.
as individual academics.
Right.
So there are all sorts of metrics that you can find, and you can find them on Google Scholar, you can find them on things like ResearchGate, all these different places where they bring together academics and academic knowledge. So the impact factor refers to the journal, but there are things about virtually every other aspect as well.
Yeah. So just to be clear to people who are really unfamiliar with the scientific literature, there's lots of different journals, and a journal is just, it's just like there's different there's the New York Times, and there's all these different literature companies and magazines and so on. There are different scientific journals, and they kind of have a name brand. So there's Nature is one of the most famous ones. There's Science, the scientific journal, which is a really famous one. There's the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences. These are all different journals, and they have their own staff that will, if you're a scientist, you do some research, you want to get it published, you send your paper to these different journals, and their staff looks at it and says, it seems to fit with what we're looking for. And then it gets peer reviewed and then published if all goes well. And so these are kind of name brands. I mean, Nature is a name brand. And what you get with that name brand is you get that in the past, they've been really good at screening out garbage. So most of what I read in Nature is going to be legitimate and accurate. And other journals don't do such a good job. Maybe you can actually pay to get into another journal through some backdoor, like, shady deal, which I see all the time in the health food world. Is there are research little articles that are published, and it's pretty clear that the journal they're being published in is not screening them, that there's some garbage in their data. But the journal doesn't care. Journals can make money. They can be money-making enterprises just like anything else. And today, things like places like Nature, you as a scientist actually have to pay to get looked at by a lot of these places, unless you already have a history with them, working with them. So it's a weird, complicated world. We could do multiple interviews just talking about how to get published and what the complications and confusions are there. Some of them also will charge you to read their papers, which is something that people like me get frustrated by, because I don't work with a university that gives me access to all this. What do you recommend for when you find something you really want to read and it's stuck behind a paywall?
Yeah. Academics are increasingly good about sending papers to anyone who requests it. Institutions are much better about having a receptacle somewhere in their library, by which I mean virtual library, where what we call a preprint. So basically the last edited version of an article that has been accepted. So that's the preprint. They're going to take exactly that and just format it in the journal. So it's exactly the same thing. It just looks different. So they'll take that and they'll archive it so that people can access it. So it's open access. So there are different versions of what's considered open access, and some of them are the university or whoever will pay for the journal article itself to be free, so that will, at the point, there is no paywall. Or you've got the lower level down where you've got the institution keeping that copy that you can access that doesn't look quite as swish, but it provides all the same stuff. Or you might have something even a bit more rudimentary than that, where it's just put on the person's webpage themselves, or they send it out on demand, but it is there. And I think all of those options are increasingly common. And we do even find things where you've got archives now of preprints that haven't even been sent off for review yet. So a paper that I used in a talk I gave this summer, which got lots of interest and really great feedback. It hasn't even been published yet, but it's just kind of a review paper, so it doesn't necessarily need to be peer reviewed to be useful. You know, it just provides lots of good information, a snapshot. So even things like that aren't necessarily ever going to end up in a journal could still be quite useful. So I definitely would say, you know, have a look around to see if someone has linked it to their Google Scholar or to a ResearchGate, or if it's in that university's archive. And if you can't find it, just drop the author a line and they'll send you some sort of PDF. So
you would just email the author?
Yeah, definitely. Or the corresponding author. So the person that you mentioned earlier that would have the little asterisk saying they're the one to contact, they will inevitably send that out. And if that is not happening, if you're not getting any response, one of the other authors would probably help, or even the press office of one of the institutions where the authors are based. So the press office will often have a copy. And if you are someone who's interested and that might somehow be useful for getting their name out, then the press office will want to help you and send it your way.
Yeah, I found this to be extremely frustrating, and especially when you consider that the research is paid for by taxes, and now it's behind a paywall. And this is a trend that seems to be dying. It seems to be that more and more things are going to be published for free, especially now that we have online publishing where it doesn't cost a publisher hardly anything to host an article. But in the meantime, there is a lot of stuff stuck behind paywalls. I have found that one thing to do is to copy a chunk of text, because there's always the abstract is going to be online. So the abstract is just a super brief review of what the paper talks about. That's going to be online for free, always. And a lot of times if you just copy a chunk of text out of that, put that into Google with end quotes, so it only finds things that have that, you'll find a version of that paper online somewhere, a PDF that's been leaked or whatever. You'll find it in most cases. And I'm finding that more common in zoology than I find it in medicine. And medicine stuff seems to be protected a little bit better from us peasants. But there's
more money. There's more money behind that one. That's why.
Right. So yeah, try doing that. And then was it ResearchGate?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
So ResearchGate is kind of like Google Scholar, and I'm not, I think it's probably like LinkedIn, where you can see a certain amount if you're not a member and you're not on there, but then if you want to see more, you have to be signed up. But it is a thing like Google Scholar where people will go in and they'll enter their information and they'll link to their publications. So that is another place where you could feasibly find someone's PDFs. And sometimes ResearchGate is what pops up in the Google Scholar search if you've been looking for a paper. And if nothing else, they would have the person's name and their contact details that are often more up to date than the ones from the paper. So that would help you then to figure out how you can at least contact the person to get your hands on their work.
Someone said, Brian Stevens says that he uses sciencebuddies.org. I don't know if you ever heard, I've never heard of that.
No, I haven't either, actually.
Well, Brian, you can enlighten us. All right. Well, it looks like we've done an hour of conversation here. This was good. Is there anything else that you want to like really drive home, especially about trying to find papers or reading? You know, we didn't even talk about the anatomy of a paper. But any topic that you think we should really chat about before I kind of try and summarize this whole thing?
Well, I guess one extra thing I would throw in, that's kind of related to something we did touch on with changing trends and papers and delving into the history, is that often I think there is a misconception that whatever is most recent is the best because it's the newest, it's the most advanced, it's pushed the boundaries. And that might be true. And it is perhaps true that you don't want to cite something from 1920 or read a genetics, read something in genetics from the 1940s and think, ah, yes, now I know what's up to date. But it is true that sometimes topics are no longer sexy. They go out of fashion and someone just sets them aside. And so things aren't advanced, or, experiments are done, but they either keep finding the same thing or they keep disagreeing, and so there's no conclusion. So actually, while it's true that you want to try to read more recent stuff and see where they are at the moment in the research, it's not always true that the newest is the best and that the old stuff isn't useful. So I think you should feel it can be really good. You can get a really good feel for the field and how it's changed if you do cover quite a range as you're browsing through. And don't be afraid of that older stuff, even if it does sound a little funny and look a bit different from the newer things.
Yeah. I typically, when I'm starting out on a new topic, the very first thing that I'll do is I'll try and buy a popular book written by a researcher. So just kind of describing the field. So recently, hold on, I got to unplug my... Get my headphones back in here. So this book, Endless Forms Most Beautiful, is a really good overview by Sean B. Carroll of Evo-Devo, evolutionary development, and kind of where the field was at when he wrote this book. This was in the... I can't remember what year this was written, but this book is absolutely wonderful. It goes over the history, 2006, goes over the history of the field, the major findings in the field. And that gave me a good head start into this field of evolutionary development. So evolutionary Evo-Devo, for those that don't know, is kind of a combination of embryology with evolutionary biology and genetics, kind of mixing those three things together, which hadn't been done until people started doing this recently. It was actually really popular super early on, like in Darwin's time, to study embryos and see if that tells us anything about evolution. But it got that field got rekindled recently. So my first thing was to go through that. Then I started getting online and looking for reviews in the field because this book was written in 2006. Obviously, things have changed since then. And then I started diving into individual papers. And that was a process that was really helpful for me. So finding people like you who have done these expert reviews and then going from there to the scientific literature and then digging into the very basic experiments, individual experiments that people have done. If you really care to become that much of an expert on a field, that's the path that I've taken. And again, something very important to note is that just because it's published does not mean that it's true. The scientific literature is where people argue about how we should make sense of the data that we have. They present their data, and then they oftentimes argue about what that data means. So does that seem like a fair summary?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing is that often things that are true or really good wisdom, it's not always published. So it's kind of like what we were discussing earlier, where sometimes there are these amazing reservoirs of knowledge, and this is nowhere even in the literature. So if you think that you've read everything and you now know everything, you might want to have a think about who else might have some knowledge, and are they represented in that literature? And if not, can you go talk to them and find out? So, just a really obvious example is like indigenous knowledge, typically underrepresented in the literature, but an amazing wealth of stuff. So things like that, where you can also think outside the box about where there might be extra expertise.
Right. Well, thank you. This has been great. I really appreciated it. We should definitely have you on again sometime, maybe to talk more about issues of women in science, because we could go on forever about the kind of the changing field of science seeming to have started out as an old man's club and becoming what it is today with today I think we have, especially in biology, we have more female scientists than male scientists. It's just this growing field, but I think the leadership is still largely male. And now when I really play numbers games with, we need 50-50 or else there's obvious discrimination, but there are definitely special issues that female researchers have in science, like we just mentioned today with the naming. Just the naming system of our culture is a problem when trying to follow someone's research. So that'd be a cool topic. But everyone, thank you for joining us. And Dr. Kight, special thanks to you giving this time. And yeah, stay curious, everybody. So long until next week. Goodbye.